It's time for PaleoRadio, only on Secular Media Network.
You are now entering PaleoRadio.
Welcome to PaleoRadio with your hosts Jeremiah Bannister and Joe Elder.
Welcome back, everybody. We have another great episode for you today. We got the whole crew here.
The gang's all back.
The gang's all back. You got Jeremiah, you got
Joe Elder,
and we've got our friend here, Nathan. Nathan, of course, is the sound engineer for PaleoRadio, making us sound like AM/FM gold.
and a great friend and confidant.
Amazing guy. So we've got a whole bunch of great topics for you today. Our first topic is going to be about abortion and what went on with the Planned Parenthood shooting.
Then we're going to move into the media, Rahm Emanuel, and the Laquan McDonald case that's going on in Chicago.
Rahm Emanuel sucks.
Yes,
After
he
that,
does. Terrible. He's a terrible human being.
Right. After that, we're going to talk about some God arguments, and this is going to be more topical. It's going to be kind of fun. We're going to detail a couple of the God arguments that we find to be intriguing.
And then we're going to finish with transgender rights and if they could be abused.
But before we get into all of that, we were gone, Joe.
We were gone for quite a long time, weren't we?
It felt like forever, kind of.
Yeah, it did. I was busy. I was off running around in Orlando. I had to do some business for my other job. And you were?
I was in London.
In London,
yes,
England.
We were in London. My daughter, her make-a-wish was to go to the Doctor Who Experience Museum in Wales. And if you would like to know more about our adventures, you can go check it out. I've been blogging about it over at paleoradio.secularmediagroup.com.
And I encourage you guys to go. It's really amazing. There's some awesome photos that you guys got there, along with the stories.
It was tons of fun. So this first topic, we're talking about what happened with the Planned Parenthood clinic and a guy named Robert Deere. This is from the New York Times by Richard Fawcett. It's called, "For Robert Deere, Religion and Rage Before Planned Parenthood Attack." According to officials, Mr. Deere entered a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, killing 3 people and wounding 9 others with a semi-automatic rifle. The attack, which ended with his surrender to the police after a harrowing nationally televised standoff in the snow-dusted western city, was a brutally violent and very public chapter in a life story whose details are not fully known.
Yeah, we don't know a lot, but here's the thing. The minute that this happened, there's a lot of people that were talking about it being a conservative person who was quite possibly an extremist religious person, and that it was a domestic act of terrorism. The right got pretty upset with that, but it's kind of turning out that Mr. Deere's, guess what?
Well, you know, Ted Cruz went out on a limb. He went
Dude, he didn't even go on a limb. He went out on the end of the leaf.
He did. He went out there and said that it was, what did he say? It's a leftist transgender activist or something along those lines.
A leftist transgender activist. Because we all know that liberals are the ones who carry the banner of gun attacks here in America.
You know, I think another thing that people knew was that the guy involved in this would get arrested.
Absolutely.
He wasn't going to get shot. And he's not a black guy.
Yeah, just a little prelude to our next topic there, isn't it? But yeah, that's very ironic that he just drops his gun, says, "I quit," and they walk him out.
So what do we know about this guy? According to court documents, his wife, Barbara Michaud, described Deere as a serial philanderer. He apparently had a big problem with gambling. Apparently he kicked her, even beat her head against the floor. He fathered 2 children with other women while they were together, and he found excuses, right? Anytime he made a big mistake, he found excuses. And according to the article here at New York Times, it says that he found excuses for his transgressions in his idiosyncratic views on Christian eschatology and the nature of salvation. And they use that term, idiosyncratic, so I said, well, what
do they mean by that?
What do they mean by that? What exactly what was so idiosyncratic about his beliefs? Well, once again, according to the article, according to deposition papers, quote, he claims to be a Christian and is extremely evangelistic, but does not follow the Bible in his actions. Okay, pretty normal so far.
Yeah.
He says that as long as he believes he will be saved, he can do whatever he pleases. There's a lot of people who say that. It's kind of your once saved, always saved to the extreme thing.
That's actually kind of like an insurance policy, isn't it? Like
it is.
If you pray or you pay, it's kind of the same thing, and then the end game is you get your little return, which is you get a little fresh slate every time. Whoopsie-daisy, pray for forgiveness.
Well, and he was obsessed with the world to come. It says, so here's a guy, he's a Christian, He's very evangelical, so he's going out and he's talking about his beliefs with people, but he's a hypocrite. He doesn't really follow the Bible in his actions. But he says that he believes and that he'll be saved, so he can do whatever he pleases without losing his salvation, and he's kind of obsessed with the end times. He's basically a Baptist.
Yeah, no, you're right. He is. He's a Baptist, which, and I mean, I know said in a very comical way, but the truth is, in the Baptist point of view, once you're saved, always saved, all sins are forgiven, pre-forgiven. You know, and then you had someone like me who was a Methodist, where it was, like I said, the game of life. It's a checkerboard where, if I died on a day where I didn't pray for forgiveness, I'm caught with a sin. That's sending me to hell.
That's trouble.
But if I pray and I'm ahead of it, then I'm caught and I'm pure the whole time. So you just end up praying all the time.
Now, there was also this funny kind of connection involved in this, and that's Cannabis.com. Yeah, he had a Cannabis.com. He also had some kind of a dating website. I'm trying to, because they said that he was a ladies' man. They said that he got all the ladies, but it was really suspicious because he was rude to them and terrible.
But how suspicious is that? I mean, I think there's actual data behind that working.
Right. But over at Cannabis.com, he would argue with the users who disagreed with his religious posts. So he was one of those cannabis users who would get onto this forum and he would talk about Jesus.
He'd get all smoked down and then go out there and bash people about not being Christian enough.
He'd call them slaves. He called them demons and how they would suffer. He talked, threatened about the worms eating them alive for all time. And of course, while they're burning in hellfire.
Oh yeah, this is a quote from one of his posts on a message board. Turn to Jesus or burn in hell. This was October 7th in 2005. Wake up, sinners. You can't save yourself. You will die, and worms shall eat your flesh. Now your soul is going somewhere.
Yeah. And wasn't it in all caps?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, of course it was.
Yeah, of course it was. So the guy's writing in all caps over at Cannabis.com.
He's a wacko bird.
He's totally a wacko bird. But what was his stance on abortion, though?
He wasn't in favor of it.
He wasn't in favor of it. He tried a couple different things. They said that at one point he bragged about gluing the locks at a Planned Parenthood clinic. And so he, I guess, went in the dark of night maybe or during the day, I don't know, went up with his glue, and he glued their doors so that they couldn't get in and they'd have to replace everything. But that was one thing. Another person spoke with him, quite a bit actually, in 2009, and claims that he said that people who killed abortion doctors, that they were doing God's work.
There it was. That's where it goes from being, kind of funny and playing along to it getting deadly serious.
He talked about the Army of God. That's another radical group. He called them heroes. And, of course, they've taken responsibility for a number of the terroristic acts against abortion providers and Planned Parenthood clinics and others. And so, I knew people like this guy.
I still do.
I do. Right? I've known them. I still do. Right? Honestly, I know people that are very similar to this description here of this man. Not quite so reclusive. They're not living out in the kind of the middle of nowhere kind of thing.
Yeah.
But there's also people in that world, like take Gary North, and I don't want to go too far, it's kind of a tangent. But Gary North, I mean, he's a crazy lunatic. The guy believes we should stone gay people to death. Yeah. Well, he just believes in the reinstitution of stoning.
Looking at Leviticus, and he's like, hey, it was just a good idea.
It's a good idea. God wants us to do it. It's the way we got to.
And somehow we lost our way finding our way out of it.
But he wrote a book. It was actually just an open letter that was quite long in response to one of the more prominent shooters that went into and shot an abortion doctor. And he wrote saying that it was totally uncalled for. Not only uncalled for, but that it was against God's law. And so you have, even within the crazy sphere over there, you've got some people who, while being totally insane, they have a view of taking it into your own hands that's much better than this guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Just worth throwing into the argument, is it ironic to you that we're having such a discussion about this being domestic terrorism or not? You know how people they're putting it on the stove or they're taking it off the stove. How often do we do that if it's a religious act that's done by Islam? I mean, that's instant, and we know it, and I don't think it's a wrong judgment to make. You go, this is Islamic extremism. This is Christian extremism. It's domestic terrorism. Simply put, the guy's trying to scare people out of the community that they're in. He's trying to intimidate them or get people to think their lives are in danger for going to certain places to seek certain things that's government funded in a type of way that helps people.
It kind of plays into something that Rich Lowry. He's I think he's the editor over there at National Review, but he wrote something called "The Left's Response to Planned Parenthood Shooting is Outrageous." Rich Lowry, Real Clear Politics, and he asked kind of the same question. He was saying, he says, as James Taranto of the Wall Street Journal points out, when Islamic terrorists strike, we get immediate assurances of the peaceableness of Islam. When an oddball drifter attacks a Planned Parenthood clinic, we hear about the collective guilt of pro-lifers. But see, that argument sucks.
If he's going after liberals on that one, and if you are a staunch liberal, you may have got that little twist in your gut. You're like, what do you mean? And you start to get you're pulling your intellectual knives out of your brain at that time, you know. But the truth is, it's not really that complicated.
It's not. I mean, look at it. Why not simply say it's radical pro-lifers, just like we would say radical Islamists?
Exactly. That complicated.
It's not that complicated. You simply add radical to it, or extreme. Or if you're over in London, they use words like fanatical. Yeah. That's a word they use. Use any of those, right? It works. And just add it to whatever ideology that person happens to embrace that was a prime motivation behind what they did.
And just like myself as a secular person, I'm waiting for middle of the road people in Islam to go after the people within their own sect and try to pull back their extremism. And I would ask the Christians in my own country to do the same, particularly because I'm more worried about a middle-aged white Christian man coming in somewhere and shooting me than I ever would be about someone who's Islamic at this point in my life in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
It's happening all the time and everywhere. I mean, we were talking about this right before the show started. We were talking about the shooting that happened
exactly
today and saying, you know, this is the world we live in, and it seems that it's only going to ramp up. But I think that Lowry does bring up a good question, right? He says this. He says, for example, should a broad-based movement be tarred by the crimes of one individual or the excesses of a tiny fringe? And this is his substantiation of this. In the prelude to the Civil War, there wasn't any doubt about the motives of John Brown, a domestic terrorist committed to fighting slavery. His raid at Harper's Ferry didn't silence abolitionists, although Southern partisans used it to galvanize opinions against them. When the Weathermen were setting off bombs in the early 1970s, no one said to stop criticizing the Vietnam War. When Black Panthers were shooting it out with cops, no one said to stop advocating for black rights. When Puerto Rico separatists waged a campaign of terror, no one said that vigorous advocacy of Puerto Rican independence should be off limits. And then you could throw in environmental terrorism, too, in the greater debate. I think he's wrong to say no one said to stop advocating for black rights.
Depending on what party you're in. He's acting like they didn't stop people in Selma.
Never happened. I don't know. What are you talking about?
Come on through, guys. Who cares if you don't get on the buses?
Yeah.
No, it didn't happen that way.
Yeah, the Weathermen. Yeah, of course. The people on the right back in the Vietnam era weren't telling people to stop protesting the war.
No, never heard that.
Oh, my goodness gracious. I mean, and so, but there's a valid point.
I will say this. I think we can be particular here in separating the pro-life movement from being an entirely religious one. I don't believe that to be true. I think there is a separation between the two. It's not necessarily a fact that everyone who's pro-life is a staunchly religious person. I don't think that's true. But I think you can go after the religion in this with Mr. Deere. A sect he does belong to is Christianity, because you can't define that word. And by the fact that you can't define it and no one can agree upon it, he belongs in the group because it's an interpretation of his own. And it's the same way with Islam. That's why Islam needs to deal with it for them. That's why Christianity needs to deal with it for themselves.
We're running out of time, but this is important. The idea of a toxic environment, right? A sensationalistic environment where people are saying things like that Planned Parenthood is selling baby parts for money.
Yeah.
We were talking about this before, and I said, this debate's going to continue, but what would be something that pro-life people could do to tone down that rhetoric, to be the moderates against the people who are extremists committing acts of terror? How could they change that?
Stop saying selling for money. It's not selling for money. If you are sending baby parts, I believe that's factually true, but you're sending it over for the price it costs to ship it to the hospital for the research.
We'll be right back right after this with more goodies at Paleo Radio.
Love Paleo Radio? Join the club. Support our work by visiting patreon.com/Paleo Radio today.
Back to Eagle and Dragon.
We've got an article out of Chicago Now by William J. Kelly, Media as Guilty as Rahm, in a cover-up of the Laquan McDonald story. There's a good little article we have here, Jeremiah.
It's by the Kelly Truth Squad, and like you said, it's ChicagoNow.com. Fantastic story.
Yes, it is. Here's something else you should be angry about. Not one of Chicago's major media outlets bothered to investigate the Laquan McDonald police shooting story, even though they knew about it. The existence of the video was widely known by February of this year. The big fat question, why? It took a couple of independent journalists to submit a FOIA request and a lawyer to file the lawsuit against the city that resulted in the exposure of the terrible story. One of the journalists, Brandon Smith, wasn't even allowed into Mayor Emanuel's press conference Tuesday because he didn't have the proper credentials. So that's the type of person it took to get this story out. He can't even go in for the press conferences.
Yeah, we need to stress that because that's actually a common theme throughout the rest of this segment is that the major media outlets do not talk about this.
Yeah.
This is something, if you're in Chicago and you know about this, you know about it through alternative media sources and independent journalism. You do not know about this primarily through your major media outlets, newspaper or otherwise.
That's true. The Emanuel administration tried desperately for 13 months to suppress this video. Rahm had his cronies in the Chicago City Council sneak a taxpayer-funded payoff of $5 million to Laquan's family without a lawsuit just days after his re-election last April.
That's wild.
Think about that.
$5 million hush money.
Hush money.
Hey, I'm in a re-election
Hush
right
money.
now. You can't really ruffle the feathers too much. Here's $5 million on the down low. Keep it quiet.
Wow. It's unbelievable what happened to Laquan McDonald.
To learn more about that, I went over to Common Dreams and read a piece by Steven Singer. It's a little bit different of a focus, but it's complementary. It's called Hypocrisy. Democrats criticize Trump, but not a peep against Emanuel. And it starts by saying this. In October 2014, Officer Jason Van Dyke shot 17-year-old Laquan McDonald 16 times.
Wow.
I mean, right out of the gate.
16.
Yeah, 16 times. I don't know. It's superfluous bullets. Most of those bullets went into the teenager after he was already flat on the ground, and the officer was at least 10 feet away. Did you see this?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, mind-boggling. And you got a guy walking on the video, and the video is online. You can check it out. But a guy walking on the street, the cops, at some point, they're not even in the video anymore
frame.
from the dash cam. They're not even in the frame.
He's got his back to him walking away. He had a pocket knife in his hand, had his back to him walking away.
And they shot him a bunch of times. He kind of twists around, twirls around, falls on the ground. He's reaching up, quite obviously in desperate need of help. I mean, he's been shot a bunch of times. And there's a pause, and all of a sudden, bam, bam, bam.
Yeah.
But as usual, continuing with the story, as usual, the police story includes all the usual racist cliches. A trained and experienced officer of the law fears for his life from a black teen. Van Dyke says he was attacked. The dash cam video, however, shows no such thing. McDonald did not lunge at the officer. The young man was walking away when Van Dyke shot. And after he fell, the officer unloaded a barrage of bullets at his prone and seemingly helpless body. And there's no other way to describe that. He was, at that point, he is incapacitated. He's done. He's incapacitated. Then the cover-up began. Emanuel allegedly was told about the incident in February of 2015, while he was in the midst of a contentious re-election bid. His administration quickly issued a $5 million settlement to McDonald's family. That's what you were just talking about.
That's the $5 million bone.
On the condition they kept quiet about the incident. It's one of those, seriously, I'm running for election.
It's like a gag order in a sense, or it's just a payoff.
It is. You guys will like this. It's money they can't refuse, right? It's too good.
Yeah.
Too good of an offer. It wasn't until after May, after Emanuel had won re-election, that an independent journalist, and once again, let's stress it, an independent journalist, asked for the dash cam video to be released. It was a FOIA request. It took the full power of the media in a lawsuit to accomplish this. Last Thursday, a Chicago judge ordered the video be disclosed, and Van Dyke was quickly charged with first-degree murder. Go figure.
Yeah.
Go figure.
How could you believe that? But again, it was independent journalists, and this is the same Rahm Emanuel that we're talking about. He says he had never seen the video until Tuesday.
How believable is that?
Paid him $5 million for a video he never saw.
How unbelievable.
Go figure.
What kind of administration is that at that point?
Not a good one.
We didn't see the video in question. We have no idea what it's about other than that it's really controversial, but we're going to shuffle 5 million bones your way.
Exactly right.
I mean, dude,
isn't it ironic? But the McDonald story is not the only major scandal involving Rahm Emanuel and his administration and the major media passing on it. Sarah Karp, a reporter that broke the federal kickback scandal involving disgraced CPS CEO Barbara Byrd Bennett, and Soups Academy was also an independent journalist for Catalyst Chicago. Karp first penned the story at CPS' no-bid $23 million contract with Bird's former employer in July of 2013. And still not one major media outlet picked up that story. A no-bid $23 million contract.
With a former employee.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, that's some serious gangster stuff.
And it wasn't until he was reelected that either of these saw the light of day.
Well, it wasn't covered by any of the major news outlets.
No.
Not a one. You know, I mean, you would think, well, what about the Chicago Tribune? I mean, what did the Chicago Tribune have to say? Let's funnel through those pages. Or about the Chicago Sun-Times. Well, that's a good paper. That's a popular name. Let's find out what they've got. Or how about Crane's Business?
Yeah.
I'd never heard of Crane's Business.
Well, what do they all have in common? All of them endorsed Emanuel, not once, but twice for re-election.
Times.
So, man, I'm guessing they did not want to have any of this information brought to light.
I mean, this is bad.
This is terrible. This is a fixed system, my friends. I mean, Chicago's results are the way they are because of a man like Rahm Emanuel and the things that he does at the top.
And they say that it's the way that it's kind of broken down the city and the way that problems have been resigned to certain portions of the city. And that those areas, what was the term you used earlier?
Gentrification. He gentrified
the city. He gentrified it, but you used a term, Chirac. I'd never heard it before you said that.
That's what the people that live there call it. Because
Unbelievable.
They call it Chirac because they say it's more dangerous than living in Iraq. And it is, statistically, mathematically, by zip code.
How does he get away with this? And honestly, Nathan, it was something you said, you know, what was the thing about the taking advantage of a good controversy? What was that?
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
That was it. Rahm Emanuel.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Rahm says it.
Unbelievable. Well, and he didn't, did he? He immediately went, and what did they do? They charged Van Dyke with first-degree murder. I mean, this is something that could have been done literally over 400 days ago.
In something that was covered up. That's the most important thing is it was absolutely recognized that something occurred, and the decision wasn't to make the choice of indicting the police officer and getting rid of the police chief. They made that decision after $5 million of hush money and keeping it quiet after he was elected, and an independent journalist finding it out for us, and not a major media outlet.
You know, when you see things like the stories to do with Michael Brown, right, and the stories where you've got altercations involved with him and police officer, you know, the police officer and other things, this doesn't have any of those elements. I mean, this is a guy over 10 feet away from the officer shooting him.
And there's a video of it in the first place. Plus, we have to mention, too, that the police officers went to a Burger King that was across the street that had surveillance on it and took the video from that. But there's an indoor video of the Burger King of the police seizing the video.
And they, right.
So, I mean, plot thickens, but the truth is there's even more evidence, and it shows that there's multiple police officers on the scene. That's the concern.
Shouldn't, and I don't know, I mean, maybe this has already happened, but how the Attorney General sent people in to try to investigate, to better understand the culture of the police department with the Michael Brown shooting and things like that, to come to an idea for does it need reform? How badly does it need reform? Do they have that? Has anyone from...
They're going to do some type of task force, but I'll tell you what they need to do. Take a page out of Canada's book. Canada has an independent group investigate police officers after every shooting or every shot that police officers in Canada fire. If it hits somebody, gets investigated by an independent group of people, and they do the filing, they do the reporting and the submitting, and then that goes to court. That way you don't have police officers investigating other police officers, which would be their peers in the same precincts. That's why you don't get these convictions.
Is this new, though? I mean, with Chicago, with
No.
the federal government sending people to say we need to investigate.
No, this is what they never want to change it to do what Canada's doing, which is honestly the right answer. They don't want to do that because you would see something like this immediately. Wouldn't even be a question. The Laquan McDonald story would have come out 3 days after it happened. The independent source would have released it. He would have been fired. There would have been no $5 million hush money. You can't game the system when an independent group is looking at this information.
You know, I got to tell you, I'm deeply troubled by the media part of this. You know, and when I was on my trip, I was going back, and I've been reading it ever since too. I went back and revisited my media theory 400 level course in college, and reading the handbook again, and reading what we had to read for the class. And as I was going through it, trying to better understand, what is the purpose of media? What should media be doing? Exactly how should media behave? What should be journalistic standards? These were questions that top my mind. And it's been on my mind for a long time, including endorsements. I mean, that's one of the main reasons that I said I haven't endorsed people in quite a long time.
Sure.
I'll tell after I vote. I do the vote and tell thing, and I say everybody is in the crosshairs for me. I don't ever want to get to a place like the Chicago Tribune. Yeah. Or like Chicago Sun-Times or Crane's Business, where they endorse somebody, not once but twice. I mean, they're really on the hook this time, and they decide that because of that, you can only kind of deduce this. I mean, you can only take away from this that, hey, this is a serious reason in their calculations as to why they wouldn't have covered this story until after the election was done.
Kelly says this: the sad reality is this: powerful politically connected investment groups control the media. They control their stories and influence their reporting, and that's the facts of it. The minute that we've looked at the news as something that should not be in the red and should always be in the black and make a profit for business is the minute we dumped this whole idea of having journalism that is true to standard and trying to deliver the most factual statements we can get. You get that from NPR now for the same reason.
And you have to stay separated. I mean, you have to literally remain separate from that whole political thing, or else you're kind of on the hook. I mean, it's hard. I guess it would be difficult to have an endorsement out there where you've committed to an endorsement and then also criticize at the same time on something that could literally lose the election, unless you just simply said, this is so bad, we're taking the endorsement away.
This is why there's a benefit to podcasting, everybody. Mm-hmm. This is why there's a benefit to independent radio and things like Patreon or GoFundMe, or things that you can throw some money at, and you can support those type of things that can advance these narratives past the big media outlets.
Over at Common Dreams, their conclusion was also a little bit dire. It said this: it makes one question the perceived wisdom about the two parties. Is there really a difference? Or are the left and the right wings just two parts of the same bird? When you look at what Democrats do, I mean when you actually examine the policies they enact when they're in office, they really aren't much different than those proposed by Republicans. Perhaps there are a few far-left Democrats like Bernie Sanders, who actually represents a real progressive movement. Or perhaps there is no major progressive party anymore in the United States. We must keep our eyes on Chicago. If there is any fight left for the soul of the Democratic Party, it will be here. Will the party call for Emanuel's resignation, or will it continue to side with one of the most regressive politicians currently holding office while it congratulates itself for condemning clownish Trump?
Wow. Beautiful.
It's powerful.
It is.
Right? To simply say, and listen, I mean, people can disagree, and, we've had our conversations about the differences and similarities between the two parties, but to sit there and point out the fact, to say, isn't it just a thing that when you have a very powerful and prominent Democratic mayor of a very popular city, that for some reason all of the criticisms that are normally launched against the other team are somehow just not there anymore?
Disappear.
For this.
They
disappear.
fade to black. These are all the things that the Chicago media knew about but did nothing on. The media knew about the Laquan McDonald story and did nothing. They knew about the Barbara Byrd Bennett story and they did nothing. They knew all about Rahm too well and they did something. They made sure he won re-election.
And this is what they've got.
They got what they asked for.
All right, my friends, that's the music. Oh, when we get back, what are we going to talk about, Joe?
We're going to be talking about understanding the arguments for God and also refuting them. Beautiful Big Think article.
Tons of fun right here
at Paleo Radio.
If you leave, you can't come back in. Paleo Radio will return.
Now back to Joe and Jeremiah.
Understanding and Refuting the Arguments for God. It's by Derek Barris over at The Big Think.
Yeah, great one.
It is.
He goes to talk about one of my favorite people, Michael Shermer.
Michael Shermer. In fact, we're kind of going off script a little here with this segment. It's a little bit of our thoughts segment, right? We don't.
Yeah, it is.
A lot of times we do the current events and we try to tie it in with something. And this one was actually premised on kind of talking about Shermer's book.
That's right.
Right.
It was talking about his previous book that he wrote in 2000, How We Believe, The Search for God in an Age of Science.
And I haven't read that one. I've read another book of his, though, about UFOs and ghosts and why people believe in religious ideas. It's a fantastic read.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's really pretty much everything boils down to one thing. Show me the evidence.
And he goes through, the writer here, Derek Barris, and he goes through kind of relying on Shermer for some of his answers to these various questions. And they list a whole bunch of them. I mean, they've got the prime mover and first cause.
He's got 10.
He's got 10.
We'll link the article for you guys. We won't cover all 10, but we do get into quite a few.
Yeah, we'll start with numbers 1 and 2. It's actually put together in the article, Prime Mover, First Cause. The first two arguments essentially state, since everything is in constant motion, there must have been something that first moved everything, and that is God. Yeah, this was popularized by Aquinas. He popularized Aristotle's argument. He incorporated it into his Summa Theologica. But the question becomes one of infinite regress, and I hear this a lot, and I know the response back too, but the question, who made God?
Yes. That's always what happens. Then that argument can be extended past. It's kind of like adding another link to a chain. Okay, add the God link, then we add the God of the God link. Then we add the God of the God of the God link. And then away we go.
And, I'm caught up more in the God of the God part. For the implications that would have. I mean, let's say that a theist said, well, even if there was a God of a God, we're still talking about the Supreme Being. We're still talking about all of this. And I'd say by what lights? I mean, you'd be doing it by the lights of the God that's not the ultimate God. It would be
But then there's one
God.
over that one, too, because the logical claim would say there's another one above that God.
How far does that go?
And it's just a stairway of gods.
And how much
stairway to heaven, if you will.
And how much can we learn of a God from what the latter God created? I mean,
Right.
Because we would need to know about the latter God too. I mean, if we're talking about the ideal, right, the ultimate, if we're talking about that one, then the God of the God. I mean, what if the God of the God is a mischievous liar? I mean, or what if the God of a God is a mix, right? Kind of like humans, they've got good and bad motivations and good and bad desires. What if the limitations of our knowledge provided by the God of a God, what if that prohibited us from actually understanding the ultimate God?
Well,
I mean,
boy.
and those are the weird rabbit trails that just even saying God of a God, that even goes through.
We start planting some roots. Barris goes on just to say, rephrased, God either must be in the universe or God is the universe. If God does not need to be caused, then not everything in the universe needs a cause. If everything does need a cause, then something caused God. And that's the same. It's the same argument.
Unless they want to just say special pleading and say, well, this is just the one exception.
Well, then you could say, why not say that about just the universe in itself?
Right, and you'd have people who'd say, well, I mean, you could, but most people believe in the Big Bang.
And that would be the one time it happened.
Right, that's it. And people kind of forget about time and space and reality, that time and space were...
Time and space are relative. They're together.
They're together.
They don't exist apart.
So even the question, what happened before time is kind of a...
It's an interesting argument. One day science may answer some of these things. It may be important to say that science is not going to answer all the questions that people demand of religion. Some of those are probably not even worth answering.
Or just simply maybe unanswerable.
But unanswerable gives some sort of idea like you've gamed the system. It's more of just, is it something
work.
that's even applicable?
Doesn't work. Paul O'Brien, I liked what he said over at infidels.org. He said, why couldn't it be unintelligent? Why not an impersonal force? I mean, life to a lot of people, in fact, arguably to billions upon billions upon billions that have existed in this world, have thought that.
Yeah.
I think even the grappling with why does God allow bad things to happen to good people or good things to happen to bad people, I think that's kind of inviting that into it to say it's unintelligent, it's impersonal, it's something that even if it was there, it doesn't really care.
That is not really, personally, that's not an argument I have much of a debate with.
I don't either.
The only thing I would say on that would be is, where's your evidence that there is a prime mover either? But at least that person is not saying, I have a God that actually has made the whole world for my species alone, and he butters my bread the way I ask every now and then. When he doesn't, it's his will, and when he does, that's because he's the best.
Right. So what about the perfectionist and ontological argument? I thought it was interesting that this was brought up. I'm seeing a resurgence in this, interestingly enough, and more people are talking about it. But the article says, this convoluted argument presented by an 11th century archbishop named St. Anselm, it goes, the Anselmian logic runs like this. Number 1, God is the greatest thing that can be conceived. 2, if God did not exist, something greater than God would exist. 3, but no greater thing than God can be conceived. 4, because 2 is in contradiction with 1, 2 cannot be true. Therefore, God must exist.
But it also, and in a way, it's kind of saying there must be a cause for our very being, goodness, and perfection, and it's impossible to think of a God that's non-existent.
Right.
That's kind of what it's saying.
And it's right.
It is. Michael Shermer points out, if the first point were true, you would have to add the false, ignoble, and worst of all which would be God as well. So all that is bad would have to be entailed with this too.
Yeah, why just the best good? Why not the best bad too?
That's kind of when we were talking about David Attenborough, right? And people say the beauty of nature, the wonderful connection that nature has, and how perfectly seamless it is. And then we go in and we talk about the worm that just eats the eye of animals.
It crawls up the urethra.
Or the anaconda that squeezes things and crushes them before it eats them. Those are part of the perfect plan too.
And those have to be included into the calculus of what is greatest.
Of what is great.
Of what is great.
And a whole other side argument to this would just have to be that perfection is a perceived idea. Perfection is subjective.
Right.
And there's different forms of it.
And I was saying before we even started this, wouldn't this kind of play into the idea that, very individualistic logic here, that whatever you think is the ultimate, right, or is the greatest, that must exist. I mean, why the idea that, I'm only talking about a really abstract idea, and then we can just debate details down below.
Yeah, well, you don't want to do that.
It seems like it kind of plays into the idea that if you can imagine this, and if you can't imagine anything greater than this, then that is your God.
And that plays into the argument that a lot of us secular people have heard, which is, I have my own truth, and you have your truth. And truth is subjective, too. And that's where it just goes off the rails.
I think it plays into BuzzFeed Christianity, too,
Absolutely.
where it's religion is just me and Jesus. It's a personal relationship, and you have no right to question any of this stuff.
Yeah.
It kind of plays into it.
Or the idea of God and science are together because everything that science does is God. And it's kind of like that's a little disingenuous as well.
Number 5, the design and teleological argument. This one is, people are more familiar with this than they may realize if they're at all familiar with creationism or intelligent design controversies. And as Shermer points out, and once again the article, there are many design flaws in nature, such as the hind legs of a python or a whale's flipper. I'll add the human neck. Actually, this is not even...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'll add the human neck.
spine is a terrible thing if you were an architect. I mean, it's an awful structure.
Right, and from a structural standpoint, it's not up to par with the 14-pound weight of our heads, especially with all the gazing down at our phones.
That's right.
So,
if God perfectly designed us, he would have foreseen the ridiculous amount of time we stare at the devices, thus our necks would be much sturdier. And Neil deGrasse Tyson always throws this one out. Look at your lower extremities. It's kind of like having a playground next to a septic system.
I didn't know exactly where you were going with lower extremities, but I do now.
Yeah, right? Exactly right.
Yeah, they're awfully darn close.
I mean, if you think about it, think about the amount of people who have just died from choking. What about a design where you breathe out of one tube and you eat out of another one and the choking thing's all gone?
Yeah.
Nope, same hole.
Yeah, not spending the last seconds of your life squeezing your neck, wishing somebody could give you the Heimlich, saying, I wish I didn't eat this chicken bone.
Yeah. I'm spitballing here, but most mammals that are born that are furry are born blind for the first 2 weeks. That's usually when they're eaten. Can't see, can't do anything. I mean, these are perfect designs we're talking here.
Oh, and talking about not being able to see, I remember, honestly, the moment where I really began to question the concept of intelligent design, and it's when I realized that I was wearing glasses and that most of the people around me were too.
That's beautiful.
And I said, it's so weird because so many creationists, when they talk about design, they hype up the eye. Mm-hmm. And they say, man, the eye is just amazing. It's really it's really not.
And its design, it began as photon receptors, which we all have, simple photon receptors that begin to wrap around each other, and they begin to make the cones of the back of the eye. And that's why eyes are very prevalent on all species, even animals that don't see any light of the sun that are in the deep parts of the ocean. The one thing I wanted to say about this design, the teleological argument, is basically the idea of, look at how symbiotic a relationship is between bees and flowers. Well, 99% of all things that have lived on this earth are gone. So there's been tons of systems of the bees and the flowers where the bees leave, the flowers go, different plants, different animals, they go, different plants, different animals, they go. And extinction is the rule, and survival is the exception. And that's why the teleological argument doesn't stand.
This is the last thing I'll throw in on this before we go to miracles. Circumcision. And this is for primarily religious people.
Born
we're talking,
wrong.
Right? We're talking predominantly religious people of maybe the Protestant persuasion. I mean, that might be what we're talking about. But talking about circumcision, saying literally every boy that comes out has a serious defect. Yeah. And because they put it into the realm of it's good for your health, there's not disease or any kind of problems down there, infections and everything, and they roll with that, well, then that's a serious flaw in the design of every baby boy that comes out without any kind of problem down there.
The doctor takes him out. He's perfect. They take him.
Yeah.
Now he's perfect.
Now he's perfect. Well, that's intelligent design, I guess. That's human. Yeah. So the miracles argument, right? The miracles of the Bible and any after can only be explained by an intervention from God. And, I was recently, a friend of mine from a city nearby here messaged me on Facebook and said, hey, check out this article. And it was an article accompanied with a video to do with Secret Santa and how this guy goes around and he's doling out $200 to people, and saying, hey, I'm here to make your Christmas better. And one of the many people he reached out to happened to have prayed a couple days before that God would help him to stop being a heroin addict.
Yeah.
And they said that, well, that is a miracle. Well, that's miraculous.
It's a miracle in the probability. But I would say this. This is the beauty about something like science. It also tallies when nothing happens, right? It takes that into account. If you have a battery that only works 10% of the time, it's not really much of a battery. 90% of the time, it's failing. Take this example. One guy that was using heroin converted. But there's not people sitting at the funeral home talking to the mom who said, yeah, this nice man came by, said he was with Jesus, gave us $200, and my son continued to use heroin and he OD'd with that money. Because that probably is the more majority of the end of that story is most likely going to be like that than it is
the fallout.
The amazing one. So statistically, it doesn't seem to work.
And I couldn't help but to reflect also on something I just saw just recently. A friend of mine went ahead and posted it on Facebook. It's Darren Brown's Miracles for Sale. It's a 2011 movie, and it says, Darren proves it's possible to take someone from the streets of the UK and turn them into a faith healer in the USA. Along the way, they learn how to scam people through faith healing. And, I mean, this is old news by this point. I mean, to have him go in, I mean, they even did this thing where they brought Darren himself up, a faith healer brought him up, and was talking about how his legs weren't the exact same length and how this might cause discomfort. And so they prayed, and they were just enthusiastically claiming that his legs were growing so that they would be even. Yeah. And I said, how terrible. I mean, with all of the prayers and all of the needs that could possibly be met, it was this right here.
Square my heels up, would you?
Yeah, so that I'm not so uncomfortable wearing my... And, dude, he was wearing Versace's.
I believe it was.
I mean, something really, really expensive.
Yeah. The one we didn't get to that we would like to write about or we will continue to talk about is the moral argument. No God, no morals? Oh, that's some heavy BS. Next topic is transgender rights and if they can be abused.
Don't go anywhere. More Paleo Radio right after this.
For debates, interviews, or speeches, contact PaleoRadio Show at gmail.com.
You love to hate 'em, you hate to love 'em. You just can't get enough of 'em, you sick freaks. Paleo Radio's on the air.
We want to give a quick shout out to Harold and Darren, the new Patreon subscribers. Remember, guys, you can support our independently funded media here at Paleo Radio by going to patreon.com/Paleo Radio. All right, let's get into transgender rights, Jeremiah.
You know, there was a piece, this is going to be controversial. I already know it. I can feel it in my bones, Joe.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be...
It's right down.
Yeah, right down
to
down the
pit
alley.
of the belly.
Okay, so right here, there's a story that was shared by a bunch of my friends in my news feed, and they had different takes on it, and so I went and I looked at it and said, well, it's pretty good. And actually, you shared it with me, too. You said,
yes.
Hey, it's something you saw, too.
Yep.
A rape survivor speaks out about transgender bathrooms. This is by Kaylee Triller over at The Federalist, and says, there's no way to make everyone happy about transgender bathrooms and locker rooms, so the priority ought to be finding a way to keep everyone safe. And she begins by saying this. Everywhere I read in the news, there's talk of another school or gym or business that is boldly adopting progressive new locker room policies designed to create equal rights for people who identify as transgender. These policies allow transgender individuals to use the locker room consistent with the sex they identify as their own, regardless of anatomy. While some have proposed a third option for transgender people, single occupancy restrooms and showers, this option has been largely struck down, and employees are prohibited from suggesting it, as it is considered discriminatory and emotionally damaging to a group of people who are working so hard to fit in. The solution? Anyone can use whatever restroom he or she wants without being questioned.
That's right. So what we're talking about here is it's not really saying that the issue is transgender people themselves and their access to the bathroom, or to say that transgender people are somehow going to be the perpetrators. It's worried about cisgender predators that will take advantage of these rules when they can say things like, the way I look doesn't matter, I can identify as something else. So I'm not worried at all about transgender people themselves. I'm worried about the cisgender predators that can gain access to places they previously didn't have access to.
And it's that last line that I can imagine a lot of people having some qualms with. Anyone can use whatever restroom he or she wants without being questioned. But that's kind of, sadly, that's kind of what I fear that we would kind of be left with if it came down to it, because you wouldn't want somebody being at the door to monitor and check and see if your card is right. I mean, that would never fly.
What
ever.
exercise of freedom would it be if someone were to say, I get to look at you, or I get to be the judge to determine who is transgender enough to use these bathrooms, or yes, you seem like you identify good enough. That's what we may create.
And you don't have to, as a transgender person. I mean, I know transgender people who have not made a transition. They still have their facial hair. They still wear suit and tie. That's their everyday thing. So there's no visible indication whatsoever, the idea that this would be a woman. In fact, it would just very much look just like a man. But they are transgender. They identify as transgender. That they would also then be able to go into the bathroom of their choice. If that's the case, then it would just be people who look just absolutely like men. I mean, it would just be not really ambiguous, right? It would just be visibly obvious.
Just think about applying the laws and how judicially in our country, how screwed up things have been before. If a man who is obviously looks like a man and truly self-identifies as a cisgender male puts on a bra and a jean skirt and goes to walk into the women's bathroom and gets confronted and says, how dare you, I identify as a woman. The thing is, legally, there's not much room you have there if we're going to make a sweeping gesture law that we're talking about making.
And culturally, it would be such that people would be hesitant to want to call the cops to say, hey, there's a suspicious person going into the women's bathroom. Well, what does this suspicious person look like? It's a guy with a beard and he's dressed up kind of like a woman. I'm sorry, we can't do anything about that.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise, what are we going to be left with? I mean, if we have police responding to all of these calls, and you know that would happen. I mean, you know that there's enough people opposed to it that anytime they see anything like that, they would call. That would be a harassment against transgender people, and that would be decried as such.
And before we go any further, we must mention that there has been situations where there have been people that are predatory that have used these or tried to use some sort of argument to get into these women's bathrooms before, correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, you've got – and listen, I mean, I don't mean to be crass, but voyeur porn is real.
It is real.
I mean, yeah.
It's a real thing, and it's actually kind of a fairly successful business.
Yeah, and so people can go, and some of it's rigged, much of it's rigged. You know, I saw my sister doing blank.
Some of it's
not. Some of it's not and has to be taken down because it's predatory. But things like, you know, people who do that, they go through many different loops. I mean, they hide cameras in places like that. They drill peepholes. You know, people dress up and they pretend that they're female. Sometimes they use cameras to look up women's skirts. But there was two cases that I came across. You had one at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and it reported this. Norwood Smith Burns, 51, had a long record of indecent exposure. He was on probation for public indecency when he was arrested in the women's bathroom at Walmart in Calhoun, Georgia. Witnesses told police he was, quote, in stages of undress while on the stone floor and would do this in the presence of several young children, end quote. When police arrived, they found Burns wearing a short skirt and jacket, black leather coat, high heels, red nail polish, green eyeshadow, and jewelry.
Absolutely.
So it happens. I mean, that's one.
It does happen. The other one happened at Everett Community College. Officers responded to the scene at about 1:30 p.m., and a college staff member said that she saw a man go into the women's restroom, and she alerted security personnel. When police interviewed the man, he claimed that he had gone into the bathroom just to use the facilities. An investigation found that the suspect had gone into the restroom while two women were inside, according to the police report. The women were later interviewed and said they had no idea that the man was inside. The man, later identified as Taylor Bueller, 18, of Lake Stevens, was placed under arrest, but when he was placed under arrest, he was found with a wig and also a skirt. So he had a wig on and a skirt and entered into the bathroom. Point being, in this case, if we were to have the laws that we had today, the person making this call for suspicion would kind of be suspect if they made that call.
If the laws were changed.
If the laws
were changed and somebody could go in ranging from somebody dressed like described here all the way to somebody who may be dressed as a man, as a cisgendered male, with facial hair and the like and all of it going, that in that culture, when you've made that change, you could no longer rely upon the phone call to the police of a suspicious person that doesn't look like he or she should be in the bathroom that they just went into. That would no longer be there.
It should be mentioned, too, that Taylor Bueller also admitted to officers that he was a suspect of an earlier voyeurism incident at Everett Community College on Monday. The earlier incident, he said, that he went into the girls' shower and took showers in there for sexual gratification.
They do that kind of a thing.
Yes.
There are people, and that's the point, there are people who will break the rule, right, without even the doors being left wide open, to break the rule and to violate that in order to get sexual gratification, whatever their jollies are that they're trying to get by going into a woman's bathroom. That kind of thing is real. And listen, let me say this, and I hope I don't offend too many people by saying this, but trans people aren't Martians, right? I mean, they're very human, and they're just as able to commit predatory crimes as anybody else. In fact, there was a long-term follow-up of transsexual persons undergoing sex reassignment surgery. It's a cohort study in Sweden. And it said this, their conclusion, persons with transsexualism after sex reassignment have considerably higher risks for mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity than the general population. Our findings suggest that sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism and should inspire improved psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment for this patient group. And listen, let me just say two cases, and that way it just kind of says, listen, this is the way that reality works, regardless of whether you're cisgender or transgender or however you want to do it. On September 1st, 2015, in Lynchburg, Virginia, county arrest records show that Juliana Fielkowski had been arrested for allegedly violating a law about possession, reproduction, distribution, solicitation, and facilitation of child pornography. Fielkowski ran the Sanctuary LGBT group. It was reported in newsadvance.com that Fielkowski had been indicted by a grand jury on additional charges of 1 count each of felony rape, abduction with the intent to defile, enticing another into a dwelling with intent to commit a felony, strangulation, and misdemeanor assault. Now, that's just one. Mm-hmm. You've got turf tracker Allison Woolbert, right? Was born Dennis Wayne Woolbert, 51, convicted in 1992 of repeatedly raping a 14-year-old girl. This female family member was apparently Woolbert's stepdaughter, and during a period of 2 months in the summer of 1991, Woolbert assaulted her by performing vaginal intercourse, anal intercourse, cunnilingus, and fellatio. Woolbert was sentenced to 6 years in prison for aggravated sexual assault, and the court noted that, quote, since the defendant is a repetitive sex offender, the risk of further offense is higher. Now, this person, as far as I know, and I know we got a lot of friends in the trans community, they can tell us about this if they know about it, but Turf Tracker. You know, Turf Tracker is a pro-transgender website.
Yep.
They go against critics of this and people who say, well, this kind of thing doesn't really happen. But the editors that took over at Turf Tracker said this series, and they wrote a whole series on it, is a chronological timeline that shows in great detail that Miss Allison Woolbert has consistently engaged in violent and abusive activity targeting the transgender community, serious ethical violations, a complete lack of transparency in the organization she runs, a near complete departure from any sort of professional conduct, ruthless use of Machiavellian tactics to cover up her misdeeds, outright lies and deceit, and worst of all, the aggravated assault in the first degree of a minor relative.
So isn't it, in a way, it's kind of like Jerry Sandusky running the boys' camp for football at Penn State?
It is what it is.
Exactly.
And so that only to say, not to demonize a group. I mean, you can't find a whole bunch of this stuff.
No.
I mean, you kind of have to.
A very small
you
group
actually
of
have to look. It's yeah, right. But the thing is when talking about it in the public propaganda of this, there has to be a degree of empathy for people who are not quite so enthusiastic about it, and to
That's
say,
right.
I'm kind of concerned a little bit about some ideas that, you know, how this could be possibly abused.
I will say this, just playing on the other side of the argument too. The Swedish study that was brought up about higher mortality rates and higher rates of suicide, that could be, and because it's an independent study, you can't eliminate all controls. That could be because of societal pressures and lack of economic mobilities and stuff that people that are transgender or transsexual have. For instance, gay people in the 1970s it was the same things were written to them psychologically, or were written about them in psychological papers, saying they had higher rates of suicide, they had higher bouts of depression, it was more of a mental illness. But it turns out, as society has been more accepting of gay people, those numbers have dwindled away.
Right. You know, and here's the thing, people, I can hear somebody countering by saying, yes, that might be true, but that's true of anyone who commits a crime. I mean, the way that it's described now is crime is rooted in people who, they're poor, they're disenfranchised from the political process. There's a whole bunch of these factors that come into play that create depression or create any kind of thing that would make somebody prone to committing acts like this. And I don't mean to go on with that, but I just wanted to...
I would just say maybe there's not a correlation between people being more depressed or having a high mortality rate, as in they die more often, and them being more criminally connected. But if you get pushed to the outside of society, you typically do become more criminally connected. For instance, transgender people, usually when they are attacked or killed in the community, they are sex workers, driven out economically without other access to other jobs.
Right, and so you got right here... It would be good to stress, too, that when people talk about bathrooms seems to be a popular one for people to talk about. But there's much more. I mean, you got a list of these things: communal showers, women's shelters, bathrooms, hospital bed assignments, locker rooms, support groups, prisons, children's sleepover camps, rape crisis centers, Title IX endowments, sports competitions, women's colleges. The list can go on. It's not just about bathrooms.
Look this up right now. One of my good, close personal friends, she's a professional mixed martial artist named Alana Jones. She fought a gal named Fallon Fox who was previously a man. Now that she was a mixed martial artist fighting a person who used to be a man, there's big physiological differences there, and it's something that we need to consider when we talk about these issues.
Time's gone by, Joe.
Man, it went so fast.
Unbelievably fast.
It was great to be back. Thank you guys for listening once again.
And make sure, go to PaleoRadio.secularmediagroup.com and find us on Twitter at twitter.com/PaleoRadio Show.
Don't forget us on Facebook as well. We'll see you guys next week.
You've been listening to Paleo Radio, exclusively with Secular Media Group.